skies, a flight from Thailand was escorted in by fighter jets.
I'm really scared. I feel helpless.
The workday routine was disrupted the country over, and rush hour extended through most of the day as people struggled to get home or just someplace they perceived to be safer. In Denver, people did what they could for the victims thousands of miles away. The blood banks were full of people eager to give. Here in LA, the entertainment industry has shut down production. Madonna canceled one of the final concerts of her national tour. The Latin Grammy Awards, scheduled for tonight, and the Emmys, scheduled for Sunday, are postponed indefinitely. And across the country, Major League Baseball has canceled its entire schedule. The disruption is likely to continue for at least a few days. Financial markets will remain closed through tomorrow, and the post office says the U.S. mail will be slowed, but will keep coming.
From California on another part of the country, from Minnesota out to the west. There are no time zones in the country today. One thing that David Wright mentioned there about baseball canceling game, this is the first time since the D-Day invasion that Major League Baseball has canceled all of its game. The first time since D-Day in the Second World War that Major League Baseball has canceled all of its game. I was very struck earlier today by what David McCullough, the noted and popular and wise historian, said when he said it's warfare 21st century style, and reminding all of us in the country who listen and read him that we haven't seen such destruction as this on our home ground, as he put it, since the Civil War. And one girl in that report saying, of course, Americans in many cases are just simply not prepared for this. ABC's Dean Reynolds is in Chicago today. And Dean, I don't quite understand what it is you have, and we'll come back to the mood of Chicago in just a moment, but there was another incident involving a plane today.
That's right, Peter. They didn't know it at the time, but the pilot and all of the passengers aboard TWA flight number 3, bound from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport to St. Louis, came perilously close to one of those planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. So close that New York Air Control told the TWA jet to take evasive action to avoid a collision.
You dodged one of the aircraft that hit the tower?
Well, he was up there whenever we were coming from New York, so what we had to do was, they were not talking to him, and he was changing his heading and his altitude, so they just cleared us to deviate however we had to stay away from him.
It was right after they had taken off, and the passengers were horrified.
I thought we were going to crash. I thought the plane was going to crash. Because when we took off, the plane kind of went down and came back up, it was kind of shaking. And it wasn't your normal taking off routine. And then you could just see like a plane that just kind of bypassed us really close. And I said maybe it was just a mere miss.
We had him in sight, so it was a nice day in New York. We were out of the clouds, which helped a lot, so we just, dodged him.
As the TWA jet ascended, others aboard said they could see a terrible sight below.
Then when we got really high up, my brother's a fireman, and so I said, doesn't it look like the Trade Center's on fire? And he says, yeah, it does. It looks like a big fire.
Now, the passengers told us, Peter, that after consulting with the pilot, the flight attendants pushed the food trays up against the cockpit door, apparently to guard against a possible hijacking. In any event, the plane continued on uneventfully until it was ordered to land at Dayton, Ohio, and it landed safely.
Stay with me for just 1 second, Dean, because if you weren't with this all day, there was a time this morning when the Federal Aviation Administration, first of all, didn't allow anybody to take off, and then ordered all planes in the air over the United States to land immediately at the nearest airport, which was how a plane which begins in New York and is going west ends up in Dayton, Ohio. Dean, now can we just talk a little bit about Illinois and the central part of the country? One of the very first things that happened today was the Sears Tower in Chicago was closed. What else happened there, and what other sense of that part of the country do you now have?
Well, I got to O'Hare Airport shortly after the attack on the World Trade Center, and of course it was basically a ghost town, except for everybody standing outside the airport waiting to get cabs elsewhere because nothing was going out of the airport. When I got into town, again, there were very few pedestrians. It was almost all police walking along the sidewalks, checking all of the state, federal, county buildings. to see if there were any bombs. The police were checking to see if there were any missing buses or trucks. It was very tense here. Now, as the day has progressed, it looks as though life is returning to normal here, at least in Chicago, in the Loop area.
Thanks very much, Dean Reynolds in Chicago. We'll come back to you just to give you again some sense of the magnitude of this. The Reuters news agency reporting out of Toronto tonight makes the point that the tarmacs of airports all across Canada, from Vancouver in the west to Goose Bay in Labrador, jumping off spot if you're going to Europe, are crowded with aircraft which are either moving back and forth across the United States or across Canada or going to or from Europe. We're just all told to land. And so in all of those airports tonight, there is a huge number of aircraft, and the FAA is simply going to keep them on the ground at least for the next 12 hours and maybe longer. There was a passenger on a Northwest Airlines flight which was bound for Detroit and which was ordered by the FAA or their company to divert to Vancouver. The captain on board told the people that there was a mechanical problem, it wasn't a great issue, but they're going to Vancouver. When they got on the ground, he apologized to them for lying to them under the circumstances. It seems like the obvious thing to do. But all domestic flights in Canada were canceled as airports were closed down because nobody had the vaguest idea whether or not there was something else going on up there. And earlier today, you may recall that we heard the British Prime Minister Tony Blair talking about this, and it wasn't long before I don't know of any other European city involved, but certainly he ordered that aircraft should not be allowed to fly in the airspace over London. And so this was repeated time and time and time again in a variety of places. But in just one place, St. John's International Airport in Newfoundland, which is a pretty small place, has taken in 27 aircraft today with 5,000 passengers. That may be St. John's, New Brunswick. I'm not altogether sure it's St. John's, Newfoundland, St. John's, New Brunswick. And it may be either in New Brunswick. You just get some sense of aircraft just being ordered to bail out from wherever they're going and to get on the ground. John Nance, our aviation analyst, is with us. And John, it's probably you should be talking much more about this than I am. But add some more to this general overall air crisis today.
The only time, Peter, that we have ever in our history, certainly in the jet age, ever had a situation in which jetliners were parked all over the place was in the air traffic control strike of 1981, when we had basically a cessation of services by most of the air traffic controllers, but not all of them. Even then, there were still flights flying. This is unprecedented except for that time in history, and even going back into the latter days after World War II, I'm not aware of any time that we put all the air traffic on the ground.
John, I'm just looking at how widespread this is. It says here 34 flights were diverted to Vancouver, 25 were diverted to Toronto. One was diverted to Whitehorse, which is in the Canadian Yukon, in the Yukon. And after the plane reported communications and fuel difficulty. This must have just been the most, we know what we're dealing with in terms of tragedy and casualty and chaos, but it must have just been an unbelievable day for the aviation authorities.
Well, totally chaotic in every possible way. One thing that we can be very thankful for is that a number of years ago, the FAA established a central control system, which is now housed in Herndon, Virginia. It's like a mission control. We've actually, we had cameras there on New Year's Eve back there on the Millennium. But this gives us the capability of coordinating all the air traffic control centers, all the control towers throughout North America, and being able to shut the system down. But imagine the air crews on those flight decks trying to get an idea of why in the world they're being told to land someplace other than their destination. The confusion factor there alone has got to be horrendous, especially the fact that when you're told to land at any suitable airport, not every airliner can land everywhere, and there are a lot of decisions that have to be made very rapidly.
John, when
the air traffic...
My apologies, I'm terribly sorry, go on.
No, all I was saying was that the radio traffic that has to occur between the pilots and their company to find out where in the world the dispatcher wants you to go, that alone was a monstrous problem, certainly for American and Delta and United and all the big airlines.
Now, you're a pilot, a commercial pilot as well, flown for major airlines, Alaska Airways, as I recall.
That's right.
You're a commercial pilot in an aircraft today. Does your company tell you from the ground that not one but 2 and perhaps 3 aircraft in the country have been hijacked? And what do you do then?
I really am going to be interested to know whether or not that information was passed that way. Usually you're just given a command and not told the reason why, because there's too much concern that broadcasting that out over radio frequencies may somehow exacerbate the problem. You know, you're in unknown territory. But I would imagine that there were enough out there who were told that the level of tension was very high.
John,
certainly you're going to be looking at your door.
When we heard that one case of the drinks trolley being brought up and pushed against the cabin door by the members of the crew of one particular aircraft because they clearly had some sense of what was going on. John, what have you managed to learn throughout the day in terms of the aircraft which ultimately were crashed with that enormous loss of life? Anything to add there?
Well, only this, Peter. We touched on it briefly before, and that is the tantalizing clue, if you will, that we have 2 Boeing 757s and 2 Boeing 767s, and those are subject to what we call a common type rating. In other words, if you're trained in one, you can fly the other. Boeing built them that way to minimize training differentials in the airline business. Perhaps that's simply coincidental, and perhaps it's very pointed here in terms of how this was planned. These aircraft, too, when you consider the amount of fuel that was on board transatlantic or transcontinental flights, and we have to consider that there's a high probability that these flights were selected because they would have a lot of fuel, you wouldn't have to put extra explosives on, and you could create a flying bomb that not only involves 300 to 400,000 pounds with a kinetic energy of 200 to 250 knots or greater, but also the, not explosive, but the burning power, incendiary power of all that fuel, which we saw do these horrible things in the Trade Center case.
So as you look at these events today, these 2 events, which are really 3 events, which are really 4 events if you consider the 4th crash.
Yes, indeed, 4.
And the amount of fuel and the explosive power, as we certainly saw at the Pentagon and at the trade towers, do you think anybody would have needed to take additional explosives on board? There was enough explosion potential in the gasoline itself.
I think I wouldn't be surprised when we finally get this unraveled, Peter, if there was a structural engineer on the other side of the world that had been very much involved in planning this. Because those decisions would have involved what does it take to bring down that structure in each particular case. I think that this was probably something not left to chance, but it also is a very wise thing if you're going to do a hellacious act like this to figure, well, we don't have to put additional explosives in. We make the airplane a flying bomb simply by which one we select.
Thank you very much, John Nance, and we shall come back to you. What we're looking at here, of course, is a videotape from a variety of different angles today. All of it just repeatedly bringing home the horror of the attack on the trade towers. We did not see the aircraft. We've seen no evidence of any video of the aircraft actually hitting the Pentagon. It came from the south. We do know that the people on board were aware they'd been hijacked because the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, the administration's lawyer basically, argues cases before the Supreme Court, was on board one of them and died, of course, along with all of the other people, and describes a pretty horrifying circumstances of being aware that they had been made hostages, no longer passengers. And we also had an eyewitness report from the vicinity of the Pentagon earlier today, which said the aircraft came in very low, and it had to come in very low because the Pentagon's only a 6-story building, John McWethy told us at the Pentagon, and was knocking off lampposts, or sorry, power posts, telephone posts, as it came up from the south to attack that. In the middle, I want to talk to our medical editor, Dr. Tim Johnson, about how great the need may really be for this disaster tonight in medical terms. The Attorney General has been talking about it. First, I want to go to Midtown at ABC, Midtown New York City, that is, and ABC's Diane Sawyer. Diane?
Peter, I don't know how much you can see down here, but we have heavy mobilization. We have cranes coming in. We have bulldozers, generators, lights coming in because, of course, city power is out. I'm told they're coming in part to uncover the rubble from a subway station that partially collapsed. Also, they're going to take a look at the rubble closer up. If you can move the camera in, you can see the gray haze, which is the smoke from what is still burning. Not only the rubble of the 2 tall towers this morning that were blasted, but also that 3rd building, the 47-story Tishman building, which had been evacuated. And then we're told that the Marriott Hotel is still on fire, but firefighters have given up on that right now. So right now, building's still on fire. Every
over on the left-hand side about 2 blocks down this way. It landed on what I think was a phone booth, but it was charred. Obviously, the inside did not have the outer shell anymore, but it looked like the inner workings of a jet engine.
And again, we're talking blocks and blocks away, Peter, so imagine the trajectory of that engine's flight. Another thing you told me, which has such a poignancy to it, you said when you walked the scene up at the Trade Center devastation, that you were knee-deep in a carpet of financial documents.
Right. Well, we were talking about the implications of this on world markets, this being probably the center of the world of finance, and nowhere was that more dramatically demonstrated than what were millions and millions of documents. I looked at financial documents, stock certificates, employment records, just lying around. Many of them were charred. It's obvious. And when you saw the explosion, you saw a cascade of paper come off these buildings, and that's what it was.
We're told it's as far away as 3 miles, Peter. And I should just say that every time you stop here, someone comes up from the EMS or from the firefighters and the police just to tell you the names of people they know who went in before them and they're not sure came out.
Thanks very much, Diane. So I must tell you, for the future, it's very hard to hear you down there because of the emergency equipment that's working in Midtown. I'm sure your engineers will tell you if we could move you just a little bit away from that, we'd like very much to hear clearly as we can, obviously, under the circumstances, what you are saying. Just thinking for a second there about the thousands of people who are outside the country. When you think that one airport in eastern Canada had 27 aircraft and 5,000 people, and it's happening all the way across the continent, people stranded tonight. And one assumes, though, the cell phone network in the United States, at least today, certainly in the eastern United States, was jammed with people trying to make calls related to this incident, the press, government officials, emergency officials. One assumes, because we haven't got any phone numbers for you, I'm afraid, of people in other places tonight who are expected to be somewhere else, and they all appear, as far as we can tell by the reporting that we're getting from a variety of places, are okay. They're just spending a night in some place they did not intend to be. We've had a couple of chances today to talk to Jerry Hauer, who is the man who set up New York City's emergency headquarters on the west side of Manhattan, right down there by the trade towers, which is no longer usable today because it was, if not one of the first, one of the early victims of these two extraordinary collapses of the two trade tower buildings. But he's with us again tonight. Jerry, grateful that you came back. You just tell us what you know that's going on.
Well, there's a massive effort underway right now, Peter, to get medical resources into the city. As you heard earlier, Secretary Thompson has mobilized a number of Department of Health and Human Services, DMAT teams, DMORT teams, which are the mortuary teams. They are bringing in the Comfort, which is a naval ship that is a hospital ship that will help provide resources and much-needed beds. Joe Albaugh, the director of FEMA, is coordinating the federal government's effort to assist the city and Washington, D.C., and there will be numerous urban search and rescue teams coming into the city to aid with dogs, with search equipment, to aid New York City's firefighters, because clearly this is going to be a long-term operation. Our firefighters here in the city, our police and emergency medical services have been absolutely heroic today in their efforts. A number of them have become victims in the process today in trying to rescue people in these buildings, and the fatigue will set in, but they are the consummate professionals. They will do everything they can to continue to try and search for victims. But there will come a point very soon where once the fire is out, they will start to pick through the rubble.
Jerry,
yes.
Let me interrupt you and even be more specific, if I may. Mike Carter is the vice president of the Firefighters Union, estimates that half of the 400 firefighters who first reached the scene at the trade tower may be dead. And here's what he says: we have entire companies that are just missing. We have lost chiefs. And Cardinal Edward Egan, the Roman Catholic cardinal in New York City, who administered the last rites to a dozen victims said the firefighters and the police were dead in great numbers. Now, I don't mean to reach out for numbers except to quantify the scope of this disaster, much of which we can see on our face. But what can you add to those two comments?
Well, first of all, many of those people, the chiefs that I heard on the radio as I was listening to this evolve are very close personal friends. Many of the police officers, the emergency service unit, these are the people that were the first responders, the first two rescue units, the first two fire units. We're all in the building either doing rescues or firefighting, and they transmitted a third alarm almost immediately, which is upwards of 150 to maybe 200 firefighters, and then they rapidly brought in more resources. They transmitted a fifth alarm and then an additional fifth alarm. So there were hundreds and hundreds of firefighters and police officers trying to save the people in those buildings. And to try and quantify it at this point, how many people?
No, I didn't mean to make you do that. I just want to know whether or not you were aware of what the head of the Firefighters Union in Cardinal Legan has said in terms of the dimension of the disaster for the fire department.
Absolutely, and some very, very senior people in the fire department are missing. There's some very senior chiefs, some of the specialty units, the rescue units. It's same in the police department. Some of the senior police officials, the inspectors that were on the scene, the emergency service units. These people are true heroes that were going in and paid the ultimate sacrifice in trying to rescue New Yorkers.
Now, let me ask you one other thing.
Sure.
The mayor has gone out of his way today to say there are 100.
From ABC 7 News, this is a special report. Continuing coverage, America Under Attack.
Good evening. I'm Maureen Bunyan with Del Walters at ABC 7. We want to bring you up to date on the local situation here in the wake of today's devastating attacks here at the Pentagon. First, we want to tell you parents and also some of you young people out there about the condition of your schools and what you have to do tomorrow. We are told that Fairfax County schools are closed tomorrow. We are also told that Montgomery County schools are closed. Fairfax and Montgomery County schools are closed. However, government workers in those two counties are expected to come to work. Also, we want to show you what is open. Federal offices are open tomorrow in the district and in this area. Unscheduled leave is in effect. D.C. government offices are open, and the Pentagon is open for business as usual, we are told. Meantime, the district is still in a state of emergency, but Mayor Williams is expected to announce soon whether that state of emergency will be lifted tomorrow. If it is lifted, of course, D.C. workers, all D.C. workers are expected to be at work, and if the state of emergency is lifted, mail delivery will resume in the district.
In the meantime, we are now receiving reports of what may be the first good news that we have received throughout the day. You may recall that earlier, Maryland Governor Paris Glendening reported that as many as 11 sites across the state of Maryland may have been targets of a terrorist attack. We can now say that a 23-year-old man has been arrested and charged by Maryland State Police with making a false report of a crime, apparently reporting that those areas were targets when they were not. We're also receiving reports now of the extraordinary efforts to save lives. 50 square feet of human skin is being driven from a hospital in Texas to here in Northern Virginia to help with the burn victims in Arlington. And we are now going to go live to ABC 7 News reporter John Harder, who's down on the National Mall, to update us on what the situation is in D.C. John?
Del, we have just learned that the federal government is putting into place contingency plans for non-emergency agencies. As I speak, government workers are being called from these agencies and told to go to locations such as West Virginia, Richmond, and other places where they may continue the government's work safely out of town until this emergency is over. At 7 p.m., we saw President Bush's helicopter land over there at the White House. Instead of the normal 2 escort choppers, he had 4 escorts, the last one being a huge gunship. In half an hour, the president will address the nation from the White House. Now, in more than 3 decades of covering Washington, I have never seen this level of security. Streets and roads are closed around the Pentagon. For instance, Route 110, 395 are closed. Closed for 2 and 3 blocks around the White House, the State Department, the Capitol. And I have never seen so many police officers and federal guards at federal installations all around the city. That's the situation here at the mall. Reporting live, I'm John Harder, ABC 7 News. Back to you, Dale.
And John, it is a good thing with your 3 decades here, they know you very well. Thank you, John.
We do want to repeat, of course, what John just told you. President Bush is expected to speak to the nation about these tragedies today, apparently in the next half hour around 8:30. Of course, we will carry that live for you.
We now want to take you back to ABC's news coverage of the situation, and we're going to take a live shot of the Pentagon to bring you up to date on the situation there, the visual up to date of the situation as the rescue efforts continue inside the Pentagon at this hour.
Clearly as quickly as we can, but deal with one thing at a time. Our medical editor, Tim Johnson, is here. Tim, we've heard mentioned several times very early on that burn victims here had gone as far away as burn centers in Canada, some of which are very efficient and well known. Is New York, at least in terms of burn centers, overwhelmed? Not able? Do you have any sense of this?
Well, I would guess it might well be, because burns are among the most difficult and demanding of all trauma injuries to take care of. Demanding in terms of personnel, of medical resources, of space, long-term care. The 2 huge, overwhelming problems with severe burns are fluid loss, which can lead to shock and quick death, and then long-term infection. Enormous problems taking care of the infections that result with serious burns. And so the care of these people really is something that demands long-term care and a lot of resources and a lot of personnel, and it can very quickly overwhelm even a major city like New York.
And so New York may have an adequate number of burn centers, but not
for the ordinary burn cases that occur in everyday life, but not for the kinds of injuries and numbers that may come out of this.
And the most middle-sized cities, which might have been what we call the tri-state area, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, have burn centers?
They have burn centers, but limited numbers of beds in most of those cities. We're going to have to talk about major cities, Boston, Chicago, cities in Canada, elsewhere, to take care of numbers that might well come out of this kind of a disaster.
And we're going to go to the triage center in a moment and talk to ABC's Cynthia McFadden, who's been there waiting like so many other people. But explain to people again just basically what happens in triage. It's a question of selecting who to take care of and who to put aside.
Absolutely. You have limited resources by definition, and you have to decide who is most likely to benefit from those resources. Some you can put aside for later care. Others are so near death that any care is not going to be possible, so you focus on the ones that need immediate emergency care and have a chance of survival.
And it must be one of the toughest decisions that a doctor ever has to make.
It is. I worked in an emergency room for 15 years, and that is among the toughest decisions, of course.
I believe, by the way, and this is particularly relevant to the New York audience, we won't necessarily find the phone number here, but when Mayor Giuliani and the police commissioner and the fire commissioner, the head of the FBI in New York, and the governor were all giving a news conference some time ago, after the mayor had said, everybody don't feel any hate and anger, be New Yorkers, pull together, and the governor had said, you know, that we will, of course, get through this. He did point out that there was a true, genuine need for blood donors. And then I think we heard exactly the same thing from Attorney General Ashcroft, who said that anybody in the country who wanted to participate or felt they could give something, one of the things was to contact their local Red Cross center, because, as we know, there's a shortage of blood in the country. And the governor also said that they'd like it if doctors volunteered and nurses volunteered. Now, there's a catastrophic shortage of nurses in the country, and the burden that will be on doctors and nurses here. The military, Tim and John, as pretty much as I understand, they're getting civilian help at the Pentagon as well. The military pretty much is able to take care of its own under most circumstances, right?
It is, and the majority of injuries in the military, and I suspect the majority of injuries from this tragedy today will be crush injuries of various sorts. Again, burns are in a very special category requiring very special kinds of care, and that's going to be a real issue.
We also know, and I think we actually can give you some sense of this already, that 3 ships of the U.S. Navy are on their way to New York, one of which, the USS Comfort, is a hospital ship with 1,100 beds on its way, dispatched by the Health and Human Services and the military. And the aircraft carrier, the USS John F. Kennedy and the George Washington, are coming as well on their way from farther down the East Coast to be put in New York Harbor, lest they are needed for a variety of reasons. And these aircraft carriers particularly, and the Comfort, are hugely capable of taking care of casualties in a wide variety of ways. Hang on, Dr. Tim, we'll come back to you in just a second. I do want to go to Cynthia McFadden, who is at the triage center itself. Cynthia, do you hear me?
I do, Peter.
So just bring us up to date with what's happened there since we last checked you.
Well, Peter, we're still standing by waiting. There are still hundreds of doctors and nurses here waiting. The grim realities are that they expect to tag hundreds, perhaps thousands of victims of this explosion throughout the night tonight. The reason the ambulances are still sitting empty at this point is because we understand from rescue workers they have not been able to get close enough to the actual midpoint of the explosion to actually bring anybody out, which is the reason that they are still standing by. They've told us the system here, Peter, I heard you talking about setting up a triage system. The system here will be as follows. Victims who come in and are tagged red are victims that they believe can be saved. Victims who are tagged yellow and green are walking wounded and will be quickly taken away to other locations. And then there are the black tags for those people who they feel they cannot help.
Thanks, Cynthia. We'll come back to you. I want to go quickly to Stoystown, Pennsylvania, at the moment where ABC's Dan Harris is standing by. 4 aircraft involved today, and we know that on each one of them there was a hijacking in process. And the aircraft that crashed near Johnstown, Pennsylvania, was United Flight 93 with 38 passengers and 7 crew on board. ABC's Dan Harris rushed to the scene of that accident, and I hope is with us now. Dan, do you hear me?
Peter, I do hear you. And we have a new piece of information on this crash from ABC's Lisa Stark, who, as you know, covers aviation for ABC News. She tells us that Flight 93, which, as you mentioned, was departing from Newark and headed to San Francisco, filed for a change of flight plan request, requesting to change its destination from San Francisco to Washington. Shortly after that, it turned around and crashed about a mile from where we are right now in Stoystown, Pennsylvania. It crashed, and I believe we have some pictures of the crash scene. Crashed in an open field. All that you really see there is a huge crater. You can't even see it very well from our vantage point. A huge black gaping hole, as investigators are describing it. There is a lot of debris, most of it very small pieces of black charred remains. The FBI tonight is making a huge grid, and tomorrow morning it will begin what it calls a painstaking process of gathering the evidence. At this point, they say they're treating this as a crime, though they won't go so far as to say it is indeed an act of terrorism. If indeed the plane had successfully turned around and headed back toward Washington, and now it appears there would have been one more target. It did not make it, which is fortunate for Washington, unfortunate for the 45 people on board. No survivors, Peter.
Dan, it was indeed a chilling moment when you made a reference there to United Flight 93 asking for a change of flight plan, headed for San Francisco, asking for a flight plan that takes it to Washington. Have you picked up anything else on the ground tonight?
We have picked up from the FBI that there was 911 contact from the plane. Now, they wouldn't go so far as to confirm a report that has been circulating. The report says that one of the passengers locked himself in the bathroom of that plane and called 911 at 9:58 a.m., got in touch with a local 911 operator in this part of Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania, and told him there had been some sort of explosion on the plane. Shortly after that, 2 minutes later, in fact, the plane did go down. That report is not confirmed in total in some. However, the FBI says it has received tapes of a 911 call, and it is going to go over those tapes.
Just help us place Stoystown, Pennsylvania, a little more, with a little greater familiarity to people. You're fairly close to Johnstown?
We are fairly close to Johnstown. Stoystown is about 75 miles southeast of Pittsburgh and about 30 miles north of Maryland. It's a very rural area, and the area where the crash happened is really very, very rural. It's an open field, and as I said, there is a huge crater. There were some eyewitnesses, coal workers, who ran to the scene shortly after the crash. We've heard that they saw the plane going down. It was very unstable before it went down, as you might imagine. People who live nearby say they heard they felt the ground shake miles away. People who went to the scene, we spoke to one eyewitness a short time ago, said she saw lots of debris, but nothing very big. And in fact, that's what our pictures are bearing out, that the debris is very, very small. This made a very hard landing, Peter.
Thanks very much, Dan Harris, in Stoystown, Pennsylvania tonight on the United Airlines flight, which started off from Newark to San Francisco, took off about 8:01. You see where it all converges? The first attack on the trade tower is just before 9 o'clock. The second one is after that, that an aircraft goes down at, sometime 8:30 8:35, between 8:30, maybe a little after 9 o'clock. And so the coordination involved in this has intelligence and military officials tonight confused, shocked, and steamed. Barbara Starr, one of our reporters at the Pentagon, reports tonight, quoting a senior intelligence official, "Our top priority tonight is nailing the SOBs who did this." And they are, Barbara reports us, tweaking every single intelligence system they have, their reconnaissance, their assets. And then they're going to go through, as we've heard earlier today, through all of the cable traffic. They're going to look to listen to all of the monitoring which the National Security Agency does of thousands of phone calls. And again, though this may not lead to anything, just a short while ago, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, who's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, told the Associated Press that U.S. intelligence intercepted communications between supporters of Osama bin Laden discussing the attacks on the World Trade Center. And he then goes on to say, I'm just going to get his quote accurately here, they have an intercept of some information that included people associated with bin Laden who acknowledged a couple of targets were hit. I'm not sure how much that tells us at this point. They may simply having been reacting, if this report is true, they may simply have been reacting, as many people all over the world did immediately, to the fact that these attacks had actually occurred. It's not going to be very long from now before the president. I'm missing anything, John, before I go back to Washington and talk politics?
No, we're up to date.
Okay. John McCarthy, outside the Pentagon, unusually removed from your post, which I know must be very frustrating at this point, John. Want to add to Barbara Starr's reporting in terms of attitude on behalf of the military at the moment?
Well, attitude and what you describe as the intelligence community is now doing is a major wash. They are going after every agent they have all over the globe. They are focusing every piece of technology they have. They are desperately looking for answers to who did it, so they can then better go after who did it with what undoubtedly, I now believe, is going to be a series of military strikes. But you cannot do that until you have a very focused piece of intelligence that leads you directly to the culprits. And then there is, of course, the problem, once you decide you are going to use military force, of trying to decide how to make it in any way effective. It does feel good oftentimes to retaliate against accused people that you believe have done a terrible act like this to the United States, but it doesn't necessarily go after them and often creates additional problems, especially if it is proved that the terrorists who did this came from a region near the Middle East, like Afghanistan. That is going to set off a whole series of very complex political machinations, Peter, that could end up coming back on the United States.
But let me ask you an operational question, John. We believe at the moment that the United States had no inkling of what was going to happen. But there's a history of terrorism in various other parts of the world to which the United States has been party, victimized by in one way or the other. After an incident has occurred, is there any history of a tendency of people who perpetrated the terrorism to talk?
There is a history to claim credit in some way. Although I must say, Osama bin Laden, if he turns out to be the culprit who is behind this, has been often circumspect in the days and months after an attack. Intelligence sources have indicated in previous attacks that his organization was involved, but they had to piece that information together because he was, at least in the initial period after the attack, absolutely silent.
Thank you very much, John McCarthy. We have a microphone open somewhere else, and I think just trying to pick up the sound that it is in our Washington position across from the White House. It's appropriate because we want to go there now where Claire Shipman has been for most of the day. And Claire, the president, I think, is going, you tell us clearly, the president's going to talk to us, I think, fairly quickly now, pretty soon now?
That's right. He's going to talk to us, we're told, in just over 10 minutes, Peter. And I think what you've been talking about tonight, a lot
Claire,
of
let me stop. Can I stop you? Maybe you'd move your microphone up. I'm sorry. There's a microphone, I believe, in your little location there, which is interfering with what you are trying to say. So do you want to try again?
All right, is this any better?
It's somewhat better, yeah.
Good, okay. Rough conditions here. But you've been talking about a lot of the anger being expressed in Washington tonight from military officials and others, and I think that is the sort of thing we're going to hear from the president tonight. We've been told he is quite angry. He's eager to talk about it. We're told his speech is going to be a mix of condolence, anger, and also retaliation, that he wants to make it very plain just how quickly he intends to act when he feels the United States is able to act. He and his aides still putting finishing touches on this speech. Probably hard to exaggerate the enormous importance of this speech for him tonight, Peter. A couple of other notes. Condoleezza Rice is at the White House with him as National Security Advisor. Colin Powell arrived recently back in Washington at Andrews Air Force Base, and we're told might be heading to the White House, but that depends on some security issues. The president was to meet with Vice President Cheney once he arrived back at the White House, and then we were told from security forces that he was going to have to leave the White House. They didn't want to keep the president and the vice president for very long in the same location, and he would either be heading home or to Camp David. Peter.
Thanks very much, Claire. We're going to come back to you very shortly because the president is going to talk. And in fact, Colin Powell just came back from Colombia today, where he has been he's been visiting with leaders of Latin America about, among other things, the war against the international drug community, which is based very largely in Colombia. And there is no reason that any part of the world tonight should be, whatever our instincts are, whatever the history is, there's no reason tonight to rule out criminals from any part of the world who have the money, if not always the sophistication. That's a